Do you ever wonder the process of urination, where there are a system of organs that eliminates the waste products from our body once it gets filled? In animals, including humans, as part of metabolism, many waste products are produced. Animals excrete them in different forms such as urine, sweat, feces, and tears. Among these, urine is produced and discarded from our body as fluid. Or how humans expel feces, termed as stool in medical literature, by a process of being discharged through the anus as waste matter discharged from the bowels after food has been digested. Or how the reproductive act, in which the male reproductive organ in humans and other higher animals enters the female reproductive tract that contributes to human or animal bonding. Or even how women's bodies are designed to give birth in a form of vaginal delivery in just 3 stages. These factors are micturition, defecation, sexual intercourse, and childbirth. These factors therefore plays an important role in anatomical region of the pelvis called perineum, which this region contains structures that support the urogenital and gastrointestinal systems. Today, we shall look the structures of the perineum as we deal the pelvic diaphragm and contents of the anal triangle. As we all know, the pelvis is inferior most part of the trunk. Consisting of the pelvic girdle and perineum, it supports the urinary and reproductive organs. Part of the lesser pelvis is called the perineum, as termed in clinical practice. It is frequently used to describe the area between the external genitalia and the anus. In anatomical terms, the perineum is a diamond-shaped structure that lies inferior to the pelvic diaphragm between the thighs, while its boundary is the pelvic outlet. In a different perspective, the base of the pelvis is a funnel-shaped pelvic diaphragm where it comprises of the levator ani muscle and the coccygeus muscle. The function of the pelvic diaphragm is to support the pelvic organs and prevent them from prolapse. It is incomplete anteriorly to allow passage of the urethra in males and the urethra and the vagina in females. Contents of anal triangle involves anal canal, defecation, and the ischiorectal. First is we will tackle the anal triangle. As part of the perineum, the anal triangle is bounded behind by the tip of the coccyx and on each side by the ischial tuberosity and the sacrotuberous ligament overlapped by the border of the gluteus maximus muscle. Here we can see different viewpoints of anal triangle in female perineum and in anal region. The anal triangle in median part lies in this area in the female perineum and here in the anal region, while on each side are the ischial tuberosities, here for the female perineum and here for the anal region. Next is the anal canal, which is 1.5 inches long. Here, this is 1.5 inches long. And it passes downward and backward from the rectal ampulla to the anus and makes a right angle with rectum by the contraction of the pivirectalis muscle. Here we can see the surfaces of the male perineum and the female perineum, and they are related posteriorly in anococcygeal body, while they differ in the anterior border because the male perineum involves the perineal body, the urogenital diaphragm, the membranous part of the urethra, and the bulb of the penis. While on the other hand, for the female, it consists of the perineal body, the urogenital diaphragm, and the lower part of the vagina. Next is the anal canal for the upper and lower parts. Here we can see the diagram of the upper half and lower half of anal canal and their differences towards each other. First is the mucous membrane of the upper half and the lower half, where the mucous membrane of the upper half of the anal canal is derived from the hingut endoderm, while the lower half is derived from the ectoderm of the proctodeum. Second is the upper half is lined by columnar epithelium, while lined by stratified squamous epithelium, which gradually merges at the anus with the perineal epidermis. Third is the upper half is thrown into vertical folds called anal columns, which are joined together at their lower ends by small semilunar folds called anal valves, while there are no anal columns for the lower half. And next is for the innervation of the upper half and lower half, where the upper half is the same as that for the rectal mucosa and is derived from the autonomic hypogastric plexus, where it is sensitive only to stretch, while the lower half is from the somatic inferior rectal nerve, which is sensitive to pain, temperature, touch, and pressure. Comparing to its arterial supply, venous and lymphatic drainage, the upper half is supplied by the superior rectal artery, which drains to the superior rectal vein for its venous drainage. Its lymphatic drainage is mainly upward along superior rectal artery to the pararectal nodes and then eventually to the inferior mesenteric nodes. On the other hand, the lower half is supplied by the inferior rectal artery that drains by the inferior rectal vein for the venous drainage, and its lymphatic drainage is downward to the medial group of superficial inguinal nodes. Next is the anal canal, which is for its internal and external sphincter. First is the internal sphincter, which is involuntary, so it is formed from a thickening of the smooth muscle of the circular coat at the upper end of the anal canal. Surrounds the upper two-thirds of the anal canal here. Here lies the internal sphincter, and here. And is supplied by sympathetic fibers from the inferior hypogastric plexuses. Next is the external sphincter, which is made of skeletal muscles, therefore it is voluntary. It surrounds the lower two-thirds of the anal canal. Here lies the external sphincter, and here. And is divided into three parts, the subcutaneous part, superficial part, and the deep part, and is supplied by the inferior rectal nerve. For the parts of the external sphincter, first the subcutaneous part encircles the lower end of the anal canal and has no bony attachments. Here, subcutaneous part. Next is the superficial part that is attached to the coccyx behind and the perineal body in front. Next is the deep part, which encircles the upper end of the anal canal and has no bony attachments. Next, the puborectalis fibers of the two sides here, which forms a sling and is attached in front to the pubic bones, passes around the junction of the rectum and the anal canal, pulling the two forward at an acute angle. And lastly, the rectum, which is above of it is a continuous longitudinal smooth muscle of the anal canal that forms a continuous coat around the anal canal. Next is the defecation. On a different perspective, do you ever wonder the time, place, and frequency of your bowel movement? Or even having that thought of when does the signal takes place telling us the desire to defecate? Defecation, also called bowel movement, is the act of eliminating solid or semi-solid waste materials or feces from the digestive tract. Wastes are usually removed once or twice daily, but the frequency can vary from several times daily to 3 times weekly and remain within normal limits. Here we can see the process of the defecation, but first is when the food enters and distance to our stomach, stretch receptors triggers the gastrocolic reflex. This reflex intensifies strong peristalsis movements that force feces into the rectum. The desire to defecate is initiated by stimulation of the stretch receptors in the wall of the rectum by the presence of the feces in the lumen. So first, in the process of the defecation is the stretch receptors triggers the gastrocolic reflex. Next is the stretch receptors stimulated by the filling of the rectum activate the defecation reflex. Parasympathetic impulses travel down the spinal sacral nerves. Then the voluntary relaxation of the external anal sphincter allows defecation to be completed, and the empty lumen of the anal canal is now closed by the tonic contraction of the anal sphincters. Next is the ischiorectal fossa. The ischiorectal fossa is a wedge-shaped space located on each side of the anal canal. The base of the wedge is superficial and formed by the skin. The edge of the wedge is formed by the junction of the medial and lateral walls. The medial wall is formed by the sloping levator ani muscle and the anal canal, while the lateral wall is formed by the lower part of the obturator internus muscle covered with pelvic fascia, while its contents is filled with dense fat which supports the anal canal and allows it to distend during defecation. The pudendal nerve and internal pudendal vessels are embedded in a facial canal. The pudendal canal on the lateral wall of the ischiorectal fossa on the medial side of the ischial tuberosity. The inferior rectal vessels and nerve cross the fossa to reach the anal canal. Next is the pudendal nerve, where it is a branch of the sacral plexus and leaves the main of pelvic cavity through the greater sciatic foramen. It enters the perineum through the lesser sciatic foramen. The nerve then passes forward in the pudendal canal and, by means of its branches, supplies the external and anal sphincter and the muscles and skin of the perineum, which are the inferior rectal nerve, the dorsal nerve of the penis or clitoris, and the perineal nerve. Lastly is the internal pudendal artery. The internal pudendal artery is a branch of the internal iliac artery and passes from the pelvis through the greater sciatic foramen and enters the perineum through the lesser sciatic foramen. Its branches are inferior rectal artery and the branches to the penis in the male and to the labia and clitoris in the female. That's all for the perineum, and thank you.
Hi, I'm Eljediah, Jurolan, and I'm going to discuss the perineum, the male and female urogenital triangle. So in this video, we're going to discuss the urogenital triangle, differentiate the contents of the male and female urogenital organs, and discuss the surface marking of the perineal region. So first, urogenital triangle. So what is urogenital triangle? So urogenital triangle is bounded in front by the pubic arc and laterally by the ischial tuberosity. Superficial fascia. Superficial fascia of urogenital triangle can be divided into fatty layer and membranous layer. So first, let's talk about the fatty layer or fascia of Camper's or Camper's fascia. This is continuous with the fat of ischiorectal fossa and superficial fascia of the thigh. The fat is replaced by smooth muscles, which is the dartos muscles. Dartos muscles contracts in response to the cold and reduce the surface area of the scrotal skin. Membranous layer. Membranous layer or callus fascia is attached posteriorly to the posterior border of the urogenital diaphragm, laterally to the margin of the pubic arc, and anteriorly it is continuous with the membranous layer of the superficial fascia of anterior abdominal wall or the carpus fascia. So this is a photo of the layer. So you can see there the golden layered is the fatty layer, and there is the membranous layer or carpus fascia. So superficial perineal pouch. It is bounded below the membranous layer of the superficial fascia and above the urogenital diaphragm. It is closed behind by the fusion of its upper and lower walls, and laterally closed by the attachment of the membranous layer of the superficial fascia and the urogenital diaphragm to the margins of pubic arch. Anteriorly, the space communicates freely with the potential space lying between the superficial fascia of the anterior abdominal wall and anterior abdominal muscle. So, urogenital diaphragm. It is triangular musculofascial. It is filling the gap of the pubic arch and formed by the sphincter urethrae and the deep transverse perineal muscle. An inferior layer of fascia is often referred to as the perineal membrane. So, urogenital diaphragm. Anteriorly, the two layers of fascia fuse, leaving a small gap beneath the symphysis pubis, and posteriorly, the two layers of fascia fuse with each other and with the membranous layer of superficial fascia and the perineal body, and laterally, layer of fascia are attached to the pubic arch. So the content of male genital triangle is triangular, contains the penis and scrotum. The penis. Root of the penis is made up of three masses of erectile tissue, called the bulb of penis and the right and left of the penis, Gurrea of the penis. Bulb is situated in the midline and is attached to the undersurface of the urogenital diaphragm. The body of the penis is essentially composed of three cylinders and erectile tissue enclosed to the tubular sheath of fascia, which is called box fascia. Body of the penis is supported by two condensation of deep fascia that extends downward from the linea alba and symphysis pubis to attached to the fascia of the penis. So here's a video.
So this is my illustration for penis. So this is the penis. So this is the corpus cavernosum, these two here, and this darkest dot is our deep artery, and this one right here, the hole, is a urethra, and this one right here is our corpus spongiosum. So another one is a lateral view of a penis, and this is the right and left crus of the penis. This is the corpus cavernosum, the corpus spongiosum, and the corona of the penis and glans penis, and this is the membranous part of the urethra right here. And this one right here is also a illustration. This is the corona, and this brown right here is our skin, and this color blue right here is our corpus spongiosum.
So blood supply of the penis is the corpora cavernosa are supplied by the deep arteries of the penis, and corpus spongiosum is supplied by the artery of the bulb and a branch of the internal pudendal artery. So the lymph drainage of the penis. The skin of the penis is drained into the medial group of superficial inguinal nodes, and the deep structure of the penis are drained into the internal iliac nodes. So nerve supply of the penis is from the pudendal nerve and the pelvic plexuses. So let's go to scrotum. Scrotum is an outpouching of the lower part of the anterior abdominal wall and contains the testes, the epididymis, and the lower ends of the spermatic cords. Wall of scrotum, we have the skin, superficial fascia, which is the dartus muscle, which is a smooth muscle, replace the fatty layer of anterior abdominal wall, and carpus fascia, which is the membranous layer, is now called the colles fascia. The external spermatic fascia derived from the external oblique, cremasteric fascia derived from the internal oblique, internal spermatic fascia derived from the fascia transversalis, tunica vaginalis, which is closed sac that covers the anterior, medial, and lateral surface of each testis. Blood supply of scrotum. The arteries is the external pudendal branch of the femoral and the scrotal branch of the internal pudendal arteries supplying the scrotum. In veins accompany the corresponding arteries. Lymph drainage of the scrotum. Wall of the scrotum is drained into the medial group of superficial inguinal nodes, and the lymph drainage of the testis is epididymous and ascending in the spermatic cord and ends in the lumbar para-aortic lymph nodes at the level of the first lumbar vertebra. Nerve supply of scrotum. This anterior surface of the scrotum is supplied by the ilioinguinal nerves and the genital branch of the genitofemoral nerves, and the posterior surface is supplied by the branch of perineal nerves and the posterior cutaneous nerves of the thigh. So, next is the contents of the superficial perineal pouch in the male. So, the content of superficial perineal pouch in the male contains structures forming the root of the penis, and it has bulbospongiosus muscles and ischiocavernosus muscles. The function is to compress the penile part of the urethra and empty of the residual urine or semen. Anterior fiber also compares the deep dorsal vein of the penis.
So, ischiocavernosus muscle in urogenital triangle, it is located here in this area, and it covers the crus of the penis, the left and right crus, and the action of each muscle is to compress the crus penis and assist the process of erection of the penis.
So, the superficial transverse perineal muscle. It lies in the posterior part of the superficial perineal pouch. The function of these muscles is to fix the perineal body in the center of the perineum. All the muscles of the superficial perineal pouch are supplied by the perineal branch of the pudendal nerve.
So, perineal body is located right here in this dark dot. This is small mass of fibrous tissue is attached to the center of posterior margin of urogenital diaphragm. So this is the urogenital diaphragm in this small. It serves as a point of attachment of external anal sphincter, bulbospongiosus muscle, and superficial transverse perineal muscle. So the perineal branch of the pudendal nerve of each side terminates in superficial perineal pouch by supplying the muscles and the skin.
So, contents of the perineal pouch in the male. So, it contains the membranous part of the urethra, the sphincter urethrae, bulbourethral glands, deep transverse perineal muscles, internal pudendal vessels and their branches, and dorsal nerve of the penis. So, membranous part of urethra, about 0.5 inch or 1.5 centimeters long and lies within the urogenital diaphragm. It's surrounded by the sphincter urethrae muscles, and it is continuous above the prostatic urethra and below the penile urethra. So, sphincter urethrae muscle. It surrounds the urethra in the deep perineal pouch, and it arises from the pubic arch on the two sides and passes medially to encircle the urethra. So, nerve supply and action and bulbourethral glands. The perineal branch of the pudendal nerve supplied by the sphincter. The muscles compress the membranous part of the urethra and relaxes during micturition. And two small glands that lies beneath the sphincter urethrae muscles. So, deep transverse perineal muscle lies posteriorly to the sphincter urethrae muscle. Each muscle arises from the ischial ramus and pass medially to the to be inserted into the perineal body. Internal pudendal artery. This enters the deep perineal pouch and passes forward, giving rise to the artery to the bulb of the penis, the arteries to the Gurrea of the penis or deep artery of the penis, and the dorsal artery of the penis, which supplies the skin and fascia of the penis. So, erection of penis. So, the dorsal nerve of the penis, each side passes forward through the deep perineal pouch and supplies the skin of the penis. So, erection of the penis. So, erection in the male is gradually built up as a sequence of various sexual stimuli, like pleasurable sight, sound, smell, and other psychic stimuli. Inafferent nervous impulses pass down the spinal cord to the parasympathetic outflow in the second, third, and fourth sacral segments. In parasympathetic, preganglionic fibers enters to the inferior hypogastric plexus and synapse on the postganglionic neurons. So the erection of penis, postganglionic fibers joins the internal pudendal arteries and distributed along their branches, which enters the erectile tissue at the root of the penis. The vasodilation of the arteries now occurs, producing a great increase in blood flow through the blood spaces of the erectile tissue. Corpora cavernosa and the corpus spongiosum become engorged with blood and expand, corresponding their draining vein against the surrounding fascia. So ejaculation. The external urinary meatus of the glans penis become moist as a result of secretion of the bulbourethral gland. Friction of the glans penis reinforced by other afferent nervous impulses. The smooth muscles contract, and the spermatozoa, together with the secretion of the seminal vesicle and the prostate, are discharged into the posterior urethra. Ejected from the penile urethra as a result of the rhythmic contraction of the bulbospongiosus muscles which compress the urethra. The sphincter of the bladder contracts and prevents a reflux of the spermatozoa into the bladder. The spermatozoa and the secretion of several accessory glands constituted a seminal fluid or semen. And the mass discharge of nervous impulses takes place in the central nervous system. The sympathetic outflow, which is a T1 to L2. Nervous impulses that pass to the genital organs are thought to leave the cord at the first and second lumbar segment to the preganglionic sympathetic fiber. The postganglionic fibers are then distributed to the vas deferens, the seminal vesicle, and the prostate via the inferior hypogastric plexus. In male urethra, it is about 8 inches or 20 centimeters long and extend from the neck of the bladder to the external meatus of the gland penis, the prostate, membranous, and penile. Prostatic urethra is about 1.25 inch or 3 centimeters long and passes through the prostate from the base to the apex. It is the widest and most dilatable portion of the urethra. Membranous urethra is about 0.5 inch or 1.25 centimeters long and lies within the urogenital diaphragm surrounded by the sphincter urethrae muscles. It is the least dilatable portion of the urethra. Penile urethra is about 6 inch, 15.75 centimeters long, and is enclosed in bulb and the corpus spongiosum of the penis. The external meatus is the narrowest part of the entire urethra. So next is the contents of the female urogenital triangle.
So this is my visual for the female urogenital triangle. So this right here is the clitoris, which corresponds to the penis in a male. This is situated at the apex of vestibule anteriorly. It has a structure similar to the penis. The glans of the clitoris is partly hidden by the prepuce. So the root of the clitoris is made up of three masses of erectile tissue called the bulb of the vestibule and the right and left gurrea of clitoris. So right here is the crus. This one right here is the crus of the clitoris. And the bulb of vestibule corresponds to the bulb of the penis, but because of the presence of the vagina, it is divided into halves. It is attached to the undersurface of the urogenital diaphragm and is covered by the bulbospongiosus muscle. The gurrea of clitoris corresponds to the gurrea of the penis, because the corpora cavernosa anteriorly each remains separate and covered by the ischiocavernosus muscle, and the ischiocavernosus muscle is located in this area.
So the body of clitoris consists of two corpora cavernosa covered by their ischiocavernosus muscles, and corpus spongiosum of the male is represented by a small amount of erectile tissue leading from the vestibule bulbs to the glans. So the glans of the clitoris is a small mass of erectile tissue that caps the body of the clitoris, and it provides with the numerous sensory endings. And the glans is partly hidden by the prepuce.
So the blood supply, lymph drainage, and the nerve supply of the clitoris is same as the penis.
So contents of the superficial perineal pouch in female.
So contents of superficial perineal pouch in the female. This contains the structure forming the roots of the clitoris and the muscle that covers them, namely the bulbospongiosus muscle and the ischiocavernosus muscle. So the bulbospongiosus muscle, which is right here, surrounds the orifice of vagina and covers the vestibular bulbs, which is right here. Its fiber extend forward to gain attachment to the corpora cavernosa of the clitoris. This muscle reduces the size of vagina orifice and compresses the deep dorsal vein of the clitoris, thereby assisting the mechanism of erection of the clitoris. And the ischiocavernosus muscle, which is located right here, each side covers the crus of the clitoris, which is this one right here. It contracts of this muscle assisting the causing the erection of the clitoris. And the superficial transverse perineal muscle is right here in this area. This superficial transverse perineal muscle are identical to the structure and function in those of the male. And the nerve supply of the muscle superficial perineal pouch are supplied by the perineal branch of the pudendal nerve.
So perineal body and perineal branch of the pudendal nerve. The perineal body is larger than that of the male, and it is wedge-shaped mass of fibrous tissue situated between the lower end of vagina and the anal canal, and the latter assists the perineal body in supporting the posterior wall of the vagina. And the perineal branch of the pudendal nerve on each side terminates in the superficial perineal pouch by supplying the muscles and skin. Contents of deep perineal pouch in females. It contains part of the urethra, part of the vagina, and the sphincter urethrae, which is pierced by the urethra and the vagina, and the deep transverse perineal muscles, and the internal pudendal vessels and their branches, and the dorsal nerves of the clitoris. Erection of clitoris. The sexual excitement produces engorgement of the erectile tissue within the clitoris in exactly the same manner as in the male. Orgasm in female. Vagina will become moist because of the transudation of fluid through the congested mucous membrane. Greater vestibular gland of the vaginal orifice secretes the lubricating mucus. The upper part of the vagina is supplied by the hypogastric plexus and is sensitive only to stretch. Region of the vaginal orifice, the labia minora, and the clitoris are extremely sensitive to the touch and supplied by the ilioinguinal nerve and the dorsal nerve of the clitoris. The nervous impulse that pass to the genital organs are thought to leave the cord at the first and second lumbar segment of the preganglionic sympathetic fiber. Female urethra. It is about 1.5 inch or 3.8 centimeters long. It transverses the sphincter urethrae and lies immediately in front of the vagina. At the sides of external urethra meatus are all small openings of the ducts of the paraurethral glands. Paraurethral glands opens into vestibule by small ducts of other side of the urethral orifice.
So greater vestibular gland, which is right here, this green one. These glands are paired by small mucus-secreting glands that lies under cover the posterior parts of the bulb of the vestibule and the labia majora. Each drains its secretion into the vestibule by a small duct, which opens into the groove between the hymen and the posterior part of labia minus. This gland secretes a lubricating mucus during sexual intercourse.
So vagina. It is a muscular tube extends upward and backward between the vulva and the uterus. It measures about 3 inch or 8 centimeters long. The cervix of the uterus pierced in anterior wall. Vaginal orifice in a virgin possesses is a thin mucosal fold called the hymen, which is perforated at its center. The upper half of the vagina lies above the pelvic floor within the pelvis between the bladder anteriorly and the rectum posteriorly. The lower half lies within the perineum between the urethra anteriorly and the anal canal posteriorly. So the vagina supports the upper third by the levator's ani muscle and the transverse cervical, pulbocervical, and the sacrocervical ligament. And the middle third is the urogenital diaphragm, and the lower third is the perineal body. So the blood supply of the vagina, the arteries, the vaginal artery, a branch of internal iliac artery, and the vaginal branch of the uterine artery supply the vagina. And in the veins, the vaginal veins drain into the internal iliac veins. So the lymph drainage, so the upper third drained internal and external iliac node. In the middle third, it is the internal iliac nodes. And in lower third, it is the superficial inguinal nodes. And for the nerve supply, the vagina is supplied by the nerves from the inferior hypogastric plexuses. Vulva. Vulva is a collective name for female external genital and includes the mons pubis, labia majora and minora, the clitoris, the vestibule of the vagina, and the vestibular bulb, and the greater vestibular glands. So the blood supply and lymph drainage, the branch of external and internal pudendal arteries on each side. And the skin of the vulva is drained into the medial group of the superficial inguinal nodes and the medial group of the superficial inguinal nodes. So the nerve supply will be, and the anterior part of the vulva are supplied by the ilioinguinal nerve and the genital branch of the genitofemoral nerves. And the posterior part of the vulva are supplied by the branch of the perineal nerves and the posterior cutaneous nerves of the thigh. So the surface anatomy.
So surface anatomy. So the perineum when seen below with the thigh abducted is a diamond shape, like this one right here, and it's bounded anteriorly by the symphysis pubis. So this is where the symphysis pubis, anteriorly by the coccyx, right here, and laterally, which side laterally, by the ischial tuberosity.
So the ischial tuberosity palpated in the lower part of the buttock. In the standing position, the tuberosity is covered by the gluteus maximus. In the sitting position, the ischial tuberosity emerges from beneath the lower border of the gluteus maximus and it supports the weight of the body. So as you can see in the corner of your right, you can see there the labeled as ischial tuberosity.
So it is customary to divide the perineum into two triangles, as you can see here, two triangles, by joining the ischial tuberosities with the imaginary line. The posterior triangle right here is the anal triangle, contains the anus, and the anterior triangle, which is the urogenital triangle that contains the original orifice. So let's go to the anal triangle. So this is my visual for anal triangle. So this is the perineal body. This is the anal canal, the anococcygeal body, the coccyx, and the ischial tuberosity. So the anus is the lower opening of the anal canal, and lies in the midline. In living, the anal margin is reddish-brown and puckered by the contraction of the external anal sphincter. Around the anal margin are coarse hair.
So that will be all for this topic. Hope you learned something and I hope you understand the discussion. So that will be all. Thank you.